Tonight you are exactly where you need to be. You've found your way to a quiet little corner of the night, where the world slows down, the stars begin to whisper, and soft stories drift like moonlight through the dark. I'm so glad you're here. Before we begin tonight's story, I just want to gently ask, if you find comfort in these bedtime moments, it would mean the world if you'd take a second to like this video, subscribe, or even share it with someone else who could use a little peace. Your support helps keep this cozy space glowing night after night. Now settle in, let the day melt away, and let's begin. Once upon a time there lived a woman who had one son whom she loved dearly. The little cottage in which they dwelt was built on the outskirts of a forest, and as they had no neighbors, the place was very lonely, and the boy was kept at home by his mother to bear her company. They were sitting together on a winter's evening when a storm suddenly sprang up, and the wind blew the door open. The woman started and shivered, and glanced over her shoulder as if she half expected to see some horrible thing behind her. "Go and shut the door," she said hastily to her son. "I feel frightened." "Frightened?" repeated the boy. "What does it feel like to be frightened?" "Well, just frightened," answered the mother. "A fear of something, you hardly know what, takes hold of you." "It must be very odd to feel like that," replied the boy. "I will go through the world and seek fear till I find it." And the next morning, before his mother was out of bed, he had left the forest behind him. After walking for some hours, he reached a mountain, which he began to climb. Near the top, in a wild and rocky spot, he came upon a band of fierce robbers sitting round a fire. The boy, who was cold and tired, was delighted to see the bright flames, so he went up to them and said, "Good greeting to you, sirs," and wriggled himself in between the men, till his feet almost touched the burning logs. The robbers stopped drinking and eyed him curiously, and at last the captain spoke. "No caravan of armed men would dare to come here. Even the very birds shun our camp. And who are you to venture in so boldly?" "Oh, I have left my mother's house in search of fear. Perhaps you can show it to me." "Fear is wherever we are," answered the captain. "But where?" asked the boy, looking round. "I see nothing. Take this pot and some flour and butter and sugar over to the churchyard which lies down there, and bake us a cake for supper," replied the robber. And the boy, who was by this time quite warm, jumped up cheerfully, and slinging the pot over his arm, ran down the hill. When he got to the churchyard, he collected some sticks and made a fire. Then he filled the pot with water from a little stream close by, and mixing the flour and butter and sugar together, he set the cake on to cook. It was not long before it grew crisp and brown, and then the boy lifted it from the pot and placed it on a stone while he put out the fire. At that moment a hand was stretched from a grave, and a voice said, "Is that cake for me? Do you think I am going to give to the dead the food of the living?" replied the boy with a laugh. And giving the hand a tap with his spoon and picking up the cake, he went up the mountainside, whistling merrily. "Well, have you found fear?" asked the robbers when he held out the cake to the captain. "No. Was it there?" answered the boy. "I saw nothing but a hand which came from a grave and belonged to someone who wanted my cake. But I just rapped the fingers with my spoon and said it was not for him, and then the hand vanished. Oh, how nice the fire is!" And he flung himself on his knees before it, and so did not notice the glances of surprise cast by the robbers at each other. "There is another chance for you," said one at length. "On the other side of the mountain lies a deep pool. Go to that, and perhaps you may meet fear on the way." "I hope so indeed," answered the boy, and he set out at once. He soon beheld the waters of the pool gleaming in the moonlight, and as he drew near he saw a tall swing standing just over it, and in the swing a child was seated, weeping bitterly. "That is a strange place for a swing," thought the boy, "but I wonder what he is crying about." And he was hurrying on towards the child, when a maiden ran up and spoke to him. "I want to lift my little brother from the swing," cried she, "but it is so high above me that I cannot reach. If you will get closer to the edge of the pool and let me mount on your shoulder, I think I can reach him." "Willingly," replied the boy, and in an instant the girl had climbed to his shoulders. But instead of lifting the child from the swing, as she could easily have done, she pressed her feet so firmly on either side of the youth's neck that he felt that in another minute he would be choked, or else fall into the water beneath him. So gathering up all his strength, he gave a mighty heave and threw the girl backwards. As she touched the ground, a bracelet fell from her arm, and this the youth picked up. "I may as well keep it as a remembrance of all the queer things that have happened to me since I left home," he said to himself, and turning to look for the child, he saw that both it and the swing had vanished, and that the first streaks of dawn were in the sky. With the bracelet on his arm, the youth started for a little town which was situated in the plain on the further side of the mountain, and as, hungry and thirsty, he entered its principal street, a Jew stopped him. "Where did you get that bracelet?" asked the Jew. "It belongs to me." "No, it is mine," replied the boy. "It is not. Give it to me at once, or it will be the worse for you," cried the Jew. "Let us go before a judge and tell him our stories," said the boy. "If he decides in your favor, you shall have it. If in mine, I will keep it." To this the Jew agreed, and the two went together to the great hall, in which the Cadi was administering justice. He listened very carefully to what each had to say, and then pronounced his verdict. Neither of the two claimants had proved his right to the bracelet. Therefore it must remain in the possession of the judge till its fellow was brought before him. When they heard this, The Jew and the boy looked at each other, and their eyes said, "Where are we to go to find the other one?" But as they knew there was no use in disputing the decision, they bowed low and left the hall of audience, wandering he knew not whither. The youth found himself on the seashore. At a little distance was a ship which had struck on a hidden rock, and was rapidly sinking, while on deck the crew were gathered with faces white as death, shrieking and wringing their hands. "Have you met with fear?" shouted the boy, and the answer came above the noise of the waves. "Oh, help! Help! We are drowning!" Then the boy flung off his clothes and swam to the ship, where many hands were held out to draw him on board. "The ship is tossed hither and thither, and will soon be sucked down," cried the crew again. "Death is very near, and we are frightened." "Give me a rope," said the boy in reply, and he took it and made it safe round his body at one end and to the mast at the other, and sprang into the sea. Down he went, down, 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 till at last his feet touched the bottom, and he stood up and looked about him. There, sure enough, a sea-maiden with a wicked face was tugging hard at a chain which she had fastened to the ship with a grappling iron, and was dragging it bit by bit beneath the waves. Seizing her arms in both his hands, he forced her to drop the chain, and the ship above remaining steady, the sailors were able gently to float her off the rock. Then, taking a rusty knife from a heap of seaweed at his feet, he cut the rope round his waist and fastened the sea-maiden firmly to a stone, so that she could do no more mischief, and bidding her farewell, he swam back to the beach where his clothes were still lying. The youth dressed himself quickly and walked on till he came to a beautiful shady garden filled with flowers, and with a clear little stream running through. The day was hot, and he was tired, so he entered the gate and seated himself under a clump of bushes covered with sweet-smelling red blossoms, and it was not long before he fell asleep. Suddenly a rush of wings and a cool breeze awakened him, and raising his head cautiously, he saw 3 doves plunging into the stream. They splashed joyfully about and shook themselves, and then dived to the bottom of a deep pool. When they appeared again, they were no longer 3 doves, but 3 beautiful damsels, bearing between them a table made of mother of pearl. On this they placed drinking cups fashioned from pink and green shells, and one of the maidens filled a cup from a crystal goblet, and was raising it to her mouth when her sister stopped her. "To whose health do you drink?" asked she. "To the youth who prepared the cake and wrapped my hand with the spoon when I stretched it out of the earth," answered the maiden, "and was never afraid as the other men were." "But to whose health do you drink?" "To the youth on whose shoulders I climbed at the edge of the pool, and who threw me off with such a jerk that I lay unconscious on the ground for hours," replied the second. "But you, my sister," added she, turning to the third girl, "to whom do you drink?" "Down in the sea I took hold of a ship and shook it and pulled it till it would soon have been lost," said she. And as she spoke she looked quite different from what she had done with the chain in her hands, seeking to work mischief. But a youth came and freed the ship and bound me to a rock. To his health I drink." And they all three lifted their cups and drank silently. As they put their cups down, the youth appeared before them. "Here am I, the youth whose health you have drunk, and now give me the bracelet that matches a jeweled band, which of a surety fell from the arm of one of you. A Jew tried to take it from me, but I would not let him have it, and he dragged me before the Cadi, who kept my bracelet till I could show him its fellow. And I have been wandering hither and thither in search of it, and that is how I have found myself in such strange places." "Come with us, then," said the maidens, and they led him down a passage into a hall, out of which opened many chambers, each one of greater splendor than the last. From a shelf heaped up with gold and jewels, the eldest sister took a bracelet, which in every way was exactly like the one which was in the judge's keeping, and fastened it to the youth's arm. "Go at once and show this to the Cadi," said she, "and he will give you the fellow to it." "I shall never forget you," answered the youth, "but it may be long before we meet again, for I shall never rest till I have found fear." Then he went his way and won the bracelet from the Cadi. After this, he again set forth in his quest of fear. On and on walked the youth, but fear never crossed his path, and one day he entered a large town, where all the streets and squares were so full of people he could hardly pass between them. "Why are all these crowds gathered together?" he asked of a man who stood next him. "The ruler of this country is dead," was the reply, "and as he had no children, it is needful to choose a successor. Therefore each morning one of the sacred pigeons is let loose from the tower yonder, and on whomsoever the bird shall perch, that man is our king. In a few minutes the pigeon will fly. Wait and see what happens." Every eye was fixed on the tall tower which stood in the center of the chief square, and the moment that the sun was seen to stand straight over it, a door was opened, and a beautiful pigeon, gleaming with pink and gray, blue and green, came rushing through the air. Onward it flew, onward, onward, till at length it rested on the head of the boy. Then a great shout arose, "The king! The king!" But as he listened to the cries, a vision swifter than lightning flashed across his brain. He saw himself seated on a throne, spending his life trying and never succeeding to make poor people rich, miserable people happy, bad people good, never doing anything he wished to do, not able even to marry the girl that he loved. "No, no!" he shrieked, hiding his face in his hands. But the crowds who heard him thought he was overcome by the grandeur that awaited him, and paid no heed. "Well, to make quite sure, let fly more pigeons," said they. But each pigeon followed where the first had led, and the cries arose louder than ever, "The king! The king!" And as the young man heard, a cold shiver that he knew not the meaning of ran through him. "This is fear whom you have so long sought," whispered a voice, which seemed to reach his ears alone. And the youth bowed his head as the vision once more flashed before his eyes, and he accepted his doom, and made ready to pass his life with fear beside him. Once upon a time there reigned a king who had an only daughter. The girl had been spoiled by everybody from her birth, and besides being beautiful, was clever and willful. And when she grew old enough to be married, she refused to have anything to say to the prince whom her father favored, but declared she would choose a husband for herself. By long experience, the king knew that when once she had made up her mind, there was no use expecting her to change it, so he inquired meekly what she wished him to do. "Summon all the young men in the kingdom to appear before me a month from today," answered the princess, "and the one to whom I shall give this golden apple shall be my husband." "But, my dear," began the king in tones of dismay. "The one to whom I shall give this golden apple shall be my husband," repeated the princess in a louder voice than before. And the king understood the signal, and with a sigh proceeded to do her bidding. The young men arrived, tall and short, dark and fair, rich and poor. They stood in rows in the great courtyard in front of the palace, and the princess, clad in robes of green, with a golden veil flowing behind her, passed before them all, holding the apple. Once or twice she stopped and hesitated, but in the end she always passed on, till she came to a youth near the end of the last row. There was nothing specially remarkable about him, the bystanders thought, nothing that was likely to take a girl's fancy. 100 others were handsomer, and all wore finer clothes, but he met the princess's eyes frankly and with a smile, and she smiled too, and held out the apple. "There is some mistake," cried the king, who had anxiously watched her progress and hoped that none of the candidates would please her. "It is impossible that she can wish to marry the son of a poor widow who has not a farthing in the world. Tell her that I will not hear of it, and that she must go through the rows again and fix upon someone else." And the princess went through the rows a second and a third time, and on each occasion she gave the apple to the widow's son. "Well, marry him if you will," exclaimed the angry king, "but at least you shall not stay here." And the princess answered nothing, but threw up her head, and taking the widow's son by the hand, they left the castle. That evening they were married, and after the ceremony went back to the house of the bridegroom's mother, which, in the eyes of the princess, did not look much bigger than a hen coop. The old woman was not at all pleased when her son entered bringing his bride with him. "As if we were not poor enough before," grumbled she. "I dare say this is some fine lady who can do nothing to earn her living." But the princess stroked her arm and said softly, "Do not be vexed, dear mother. I am a famous spinner, and can sit at my wheel all day without breaking a thread." And she kept her word, but in spite of the efforts of all three, they became poorer and poorer, and at the end of 6 months it was agreed that the husband should go to the neighboring town to get work. Here he met a merchant who was about to start on a long journey with a train of camels laden with goods of all sorts, and needed a man to help him. The widow's son begged that he would take him as a servant, and to this the merchant assented, giving him his whole year's salary beforehand. The young man returned home with the news, and next day bade farewell to his mother and his wife, who were very sad at parting from him. "Do not forget me while you are absent," whispered the princess as she flung her arms round his neck. "And as you pass by the well which lies near the city gate, stop and greet the old man you will find sitting there. Kiss his hand, and then ask him what counsel he can give you for your journey." Then the youth set out, and when he reached the well where the old man was sitting, he asked the questions as his wife had bidden him. "My son," replied the old man, "you have done well to come to me, and in return remember 3 things. She whom the heart loves is ever the most beautiful. Patience is the first step on the road to happiness. He wins who waits." The young man thanked him and went on his way. Next morning early the caravan set out, and before sunset it had arrived at the first halting place, round some wells, where another company of merchants had already encamped. But no rain had fallen for a long while in that rocky country, and both men and beasts were parched with thirst. To be sure, there was another well about half a mile away, where there was always water. But to get it you had to be lowered deep down, and besides, no one who had ever descended that well had been known to come back. However, till they could store some water in their bags of goat skin, the caravans dared not go further into the desert, and on the night of the arrival of the widow's son and his master, the merchants had decided to offer a large reward to anyone who was brave enough to go down into the enchanted well and bring some up. Thus it happened that at sunrise the young man was aroused from his sleep by a herald making his round of the camp, proclaiming that every merchant present would give 1,000 piastres to the man who would risk his life to bring water for themselves and their camels. The youth hesitated for a little while when he heard the proclamation. The story of the well had spread far and wide, and long ago had reached his ears. The danger was great, he knew. But then, if he came back alive, he would be the possessor of 80,000 piastres. He turned to the herald who was passing the tent. "I will go," said he. "What madness!" cried his master, who happened to be standing near. "You are too young to throw away your life like that. Run after the herald and tell him you take back your offer." But the young man shook his head, and the merchant saw that it was useless to try and persuade him. "Well, it is your own affair," he observed at last. "If you must go, you must. Only if you ever return, I will give you a camel's load of goods and my best mule besides." And touching his turban in token of farewell, he entered the tent. Hardly had he done so than a crowd of men were seen pouring out of the camp. "How can we thank you?" they exclaimed, pressing round the youth. "Our camels as well as ourselves are almost dead of thirst. See, here is the rope we have brought to let you down." "Come then," answered the youth. And they all set out. On reaching the well, the rope was knotted securely under his arms. A big goat-skin bottle was given him, and he was gently lowered to the bottom of the pit. Here a clear stream was bubbling over the rocks, and, Stooping down, he was about to drink, when a huge Arab appeared before him, saying in a loud voice, "Come with me." The young man rose, never doubting that his last hour had come. But as he could do nothing, he followed the Arab into a brilliantly lighted hall on the further side of the little river. There his guide sat down, and drawing towards him two boys, one black and the other white, he said to the stranger, "I have a question to ask you. If you answer it right, your life shall be spared. If not, your head will be forfeit, as the head of many another has been before you. Tell me, which of my two children do I think the handsomer?" The question did not seem a hard one, for while the white boy was as beautiful a child as ever was seen, his brother was ugly even for a Negro. But just as the youth was going to speak, the old man's counsel flashed into the youth's mind, and he replied hastily, "The one whom we love best is always the handsomest." "You have saved me," cried the Arab, rising quickly from his seat and pressing the young man in his arms. "Ah, if you could only guess what I have suffered from the stupidity of all the people to whom I have put that question. And I was condemned by a wicked genius to remain here until it was answered. But what brought you to this place? And how can I reward you for what you have done for me?" "By helping me to draw enough water for my caravan of 80 merchants and their camels, who are dying for want of it," replied the youth. "That is easily done," said the Arab. "Take these 3 apples, and when you have filled your skin and are ready to be drawn up, lay one of them on the ground. Halfway to the earth let fall another, and at the top drop the third. If you follow my directions, no harm will happen to you. And take besides these 3 pomegranates, green, red, and white. One day you will find a use for them." The young man did as he was told and stepped out on the rocky waste, where the merchants were anxiously awaiting him. Oh, how thirsty they all were! But even after the camels had drunk, the skin seemed as full as ever. Full of gratitude for their deliverance, the merchants pressed the money into his hands, while his own master bade him choose what goods he liked and a mule to carry them. So the widow's son was rich at last, and when the merchant had sold his merchandise and returned home to his native city, his servant hired a man by whom he sent the money and the mule back to his wife. "I will send the pomegranates also," thought he, "for if I leave them in my turban, they may some day fall out." And he drew them out of his turban. But the fruit had vanished, and in their places were 3 precious stones, green, white, and red. For a long time he remained with the merchant, who gradually trusted him with all his business, and gave him a large share of the money he made. When his master died, the young man wished to return home, but the widow begged him to stay and help her, and one day he awoke with a start, to remember that 20 years had passed since he had gone away. "I want to see my wife," he said next morning to his mistress. "If at any time I can be of use to you, send a messenger to me. Meanwhile I have told Hassan what to do." And mounting a camel, he set out. Now, soon after he had taken service with the merchant, a little boy had been born to him, and both the princess and the old woman toiled hard all day to get the baby food and clothing. When the money and the pomegranates arrived, there was no need for them to work any more, and the princess saw at once that they were not fruit at all, but precious stones of great value. The old woman, however, not being accustomed, like her daughter-in-law, to the sight of jewels, took them only for common fruit and wished to give them to the child to eat. She was very angry when the princess hastily took them from her and hid them in her dress, while she went to the market and bought the 3 finest pomegranates she could find, which she handed the old woman for the little boy. Then she bought beautiful new clothes for all of them, and when they were dressed they looked as fine as could be. Next, she took out one of the precious stones which her husband had sent her, and placed it in a small silver box. This she wrapped up in a handkerchief embroidered in gold, and filled the old woman's pockets with gold and silver pieces. "Go, dear mother," she said, "to the palace, and present the jewel to the king. And if he asks you what he can give you in return, tell him that you want a paper with his seal attached, proclaiming that no one is to meddle with anything you may choose to do. Before you leave the palace, distribute the money amongst the servants." The old woman took the box and started for the palace. No one there had ever seen a ruby of such beauty, and the most famous jeweler in the town was summoned to declare its value. But all he could say was, "If a boy threw a stone into the air with all his might, and you could pile up gold as high as the flight of the stone, it would not be sufficient to pay for this ruby." At these words the king's face fell. Having once seen the ruby, he could not bear to part with it, yet all the money in his treasury would not be enough to buy it. So for a little while he remained silent, wondering what offer he could make the old woman, and at last he said, "If I cannot give you its worth in money, is there anything you will take in exchange?" "A paper signed by your hand and sealed with your seal, proclaiming that I may do what I will without let or hindrance," answered she promptly. And the king, delighted to have obtained what he coveted at so small a cost, gave her the paper without delay. Then the old woman took her leave and returned home. The fame of this wonderful ruby soon spread far and wide, and envoys arrived at the little house to know if there were more stones to sell. Each king was so anxious to gain possession of the treasure that he bade his messenger outbid all the rest, and so the princess sold the 2 remaining stones for a sum of money so large that if the gold pieces had been spread out, they would have reached from here to the moon. The first thing she did was to build a palace by the side of the cottage, and it was raised on pillars of gold, in which were set great diamonds, which blazed night and day. Of course, the news of this palace was the first thing that reached the king her father on his return from the wars, and he hurried to see it. In the doorway stood a young man of 20, who was his grandson, though neither of them knew it, and so pleased was the king with the appearance of the youth that he carried him back to his own palace and made him commander of the whole army. Not long after this, the widow's son returned to his native land. There, sure enough, was the tiny cottage where he had lived with his mother, but the gorgeous building beside it was quite new to him. What had become of his wife and his mother, and who could be dwelling in that other wonderful place? These were the first thoughts that flashed through his mind, but not wishing to betray himself by asking questions of passing strangers, he climbed up into a tree that stood opposite the palace and watched Dot. By dash and dash by, a lady came out and began to gather some of the roses and jessamine that hung about the porch. The 20 years that had passed since he had last beheld her vanished in an instant, and he knew her to be his own wife, looking almost as young and beautiful as on the day of their parting. He was about to jump down from the tree and hasten to her side, when she was joined by a young man who placed his arm affectionately round her neck. At this sight, the angry husband drew his bow, but before he could let fly the arrow, the counsel of the wise man came back to him. Patience is the first step on the road to happiness. And he laid it down again. Dot. At this moment, the princess turned, and drawing her companion's head down to hers, kissed him on each cheek. A second time blind rage filled the heart of the watcher, and he snatched up his bow from the branch where it hung, when words heard long since seemed to sound in his ears. He wins who waits. And the bow dropped to his side. Then, through the silent air came the sound of the youth's voice. "Mother, can you tell me nothing about my father? Does he still live, and will he never return to us?" "Alas, my son, how can I answer you?" replied the lady. 20 years have passed since he left us to make his fortune, and in that time only once have I heard aught of him. But what has brought him to your mind just now?" "Because last night I dreamed that he was here," said the youth, "and then I remembered what I have so long forgotten, that I had a father, though even his very history was strange to me. And now tell me, I pray you, all you can concerning him." And standing under the jessamine, the son learnt his father's history, and the man in the tree listened also. "Oh," exclaimed the youth when it was ended, while he twisted his hands in pain, "I am general in chief. You are the king's daughter, and we have the most splendid palace in the whole world. Yet my father lives we know not where, and, for all we can guess, may be poor and miserable. Tomorrow I will ask the king to give me soldiers, and I will seek him over the whole earth till I find him." Then the man came down from the tree and clasped his wife and son in his arms. All that night they talked, and when the sun rose it still found them talking. But as soon as it was proper, he went up to the palace to pay his homage to the king, and to inform him of all that had happened, and who they all really were. The king was overjoyed to think that his daughter, whom he had long since forgiven and sorely missed, was living at his gates, and was, besides, the mother of the youth who was so dear to him. "It was written beforehand," cried the monarch. "You are my son-in-law before the world, and shall be king after me." and the man bowed his head. He had waited, and he had won. Once upon a time there lived an old woman who had a small cottage on the edge of the forest. Behind the cottage was a garden in which all sorts of vegetables grew, and beyond that a field with 2 or 3 cows in it, so her neighbors considered her quite rich and envied her greatly. As long as she was strong enough to work all day in her garden, the old woman never felt lonely. But after a while she had a bad illness, which left her much weaker than before, and she began to think that now and then it would be nice to have someone to speak to. Just at this moment she heard of the death of a shepherd and his wife, who dwelt on the other side of the plain, leaving a little boy quite alone in the world. "That will just suit me," she said, and sent a man over to bring the child, whom she intended to adopt for her own. Now the boy, who was about 12 years old, ought to have considered himself very lucky, for his new mother was as kind to him as the old one. But, unfortunately, he made friends with some bad, rude companions whose tricks caused them to be a terror to everyone, and the poor old woman never ceased regretting her lost solitude. Things went on in this way for some years, till the boy became a man. Perhaps if he were to be married, he might sober down, she thought to herself, and she inquired among the neighbors what girls there were of an age to choose from. At length one was found, good and industrious, as well as pretty. And as the young man raised no objections, the wedding took place at once, and the bride and bridegroom went to live in the cottage with the old woman. But no change was to be seen in the husband's conduct. All day long he was out amusing himself in the company of his former friends, and if his wife dared to say anything to him on his return home, he beat her with his stick. And next year, when a baby was born to them, he beat it also. At length the old woman's patience was worn out. She saw that it was quite useless to expect the lazy, idle creature to mend his ways. And one day she said to him, "Do you mean to go on like this forever? Remember, you are no longer a boy, and it is time that you left off behaving like one. Come, shake off your bad habits and work for your wife and child, and above all, stop beating them. If not, I will transform you into an ass, and heavy loads shall be piled on your back, and men shall ride you. Briars shall be your food, a goad shall prick you, and in your turn you shall know how it feels to be beaten." But if she expected her words to do any good, she soon found out her mistake, for the young man only grew angry and cried rudely, "Bah! Hold your tongue, or I will whip you also." "Will you?" she answered grimly, and swift as lightning she picked up a steel cane that stood in the corner and laid it across his shoulders. In an instant his ears had grown long and his face longer. His arms had become legs, and his body was covered with close gray hair. Truly, he was an ass, and a very ugly one, too. "Leave the house," commanded the old woman, and shambling awkwardly he went. As he was standing in the path outside, not knowing what to do, a man passed by. "Ho, my fine fellow, you are exactly what I was looking for. You don't seem to have a master, so come with me." I will find something for you to do." And taking him by the ear, he led him from the cottage. For 7 years the ass led a hard life, just as the old woman had foretold. But instead of remembering that he had brought all his suffering on himself, and being sorry for his evil ways, he grew harder and more bitter. At the end of the 7 years, his ass skin wore out, and he became a man again, and one day returned to the cottage. His wife opened the door in answer to his knock. Then, letting fall the latch, she ran inside, crying, "Grandmother, grandmother, your son has come back." "I thought he would," replied the old woman, going on with her spinning. "Well, we could have done very well without him, but as he is here, I suppose he must come in." And come in he did. But as the old woman expected, he behaved still worse than before. For some weeks she allowed him to do what he liked. Then at last she said, "So experience has taught you nothing. After all, there are very few people who have sense to learn by it. But take care lest I change you into a wolf, to be a prey for dogs and men. You talk too much. I shall break your head for you," was all the answer she got. Had the young man looked at her face, he might have taken warning, but he was busy making a pipe, and took no notice. The next moment the steel cane had touched his shoulders, and a big gray wolf bounded through the door. Oh, what a yapping among the dogs, and what a shouting among the neighbors as they gave chase. For 7 years he led the life of a hunted animal, often cold and nearly always hungry, and never daring to allow himself a sound sleep. At the end of that time his wolf skin wore out also, and again he appeared at the cottage door. But the second 7 years had taught him no more than the first. His conduct was worse than before, and one day he beat his wife and son so brutally that they screamed to the old woman to come to their aid. She did, and brought the steel cane with her. In a second the ruffian had vanished, and a big black crow was flying about the room, crying, "Gore, gore." The window was open, and he darted through it, and seeking the companions who had ruined him, he managed to make them understand what had happened. "We will avenge you," said they, and taking up a rope, set out to strangle the old woman. But she was ready for them. One stroke of her cane, and they were all changed into a troop of black crows. And this time their feathers are lasting still. Once upon a time there lived a king and queen who ruled over a country so small that you could easily walk round it in one day. They were both very good, simple people, not very wise perhaps, but anxious to be kind to everybody. And this was often a mistake, for the king allowed all his subjects to talk at once, and offer advice upon the government of the kingdom as well as upon private matters. And the end of it all was that it was very difficult to get any laws made, and still more, to get anyone to obey them. Now, no traveler ever passed through the kingdom without inquiring how it came to be so small. And this was the reason. As soon as Pataldo, for that was the king's name, had been born, His father and mother betrothed him to the niece of their friend, the fairy Gangana, if she should ever have one. But as the years passed on, and Gangana was still without a niece, the young prince forgot all about his destined bride, and when he was 25, he secretly married the beautiful daughter of a rich farmer, with whom he had fallen violently in love. When the fairy heard the news, she fell into a violent rage, and hurried off to tell the king. The old man thought in his heart that his son had waited quite long enough, but he did not dare to say so, lest some dreadful spell might be thrown over them all, and they should be changed into birds or snakes, or, worst of all, into stones. So, much against his will, he was obliged to disinherit the young man, and to forbid him to come to court. Indeed, he would have been a beggar had it not been for the property his wife had given her by the farmer, which the youth obtained permission to erect into a kingdom. Most princes would have been very angry at this treatment, especially as the old king soon died, and the queen was delighted to reign in his place. But Petaldo was a contented young man, and was quite satisfied with arranging his tiny court on the model of his father's, and having a lord chamberlain, and a high steward and several gentlemen in attendance, while the young queen appointed her own ladies-in-waiting and maids of honor. He likewise set up a mint to coin money, and chose a seneschal as head of the 5 policemen who kept order in the capital, and punished the boys who were caught in the act of throwing stones at the palace windows. The first to fill this important office was the young king's father-in-law, an excellent man of the name of Caboche. He was much beloved by everyone, and so sensible that he was not at all vain at rising at once to the dignity of seneschal, when he had only been a common farmer, but went about his fields every day as usual. This conduct so struck his king that very soon he never did anything without consulting him. Each morning Caboche and his son-in-law had breakfast together, and when they had finished, the king took out of his iron chest great bundles of state papers, which he desired to talk over with his seneschal. Sometimes they would spend 2 hours at least in deciding these important matters, but more often, after a few minutes, Caboche would say, "Excuse me, sire, but your Majesty does not understand this affair in the least. Leave it to me, and I will settle it." "But what am I to do, then?" asked the king. And his minister answered, "Oh, you can rule your wife and see after your fruit garden. You will find that those 2 things will take up all your time." "Well, perhaps you are right," the king replied, secretly glad to be rid of the cares of government. But though Caboche did all the work, Petaldo never failed to appear on grand occasions in his royal mantle of red linen, holding a scepter of gilded wood. Meanwhile he passed his mornings in studying books, from which he learned the proper seasons to plant his fruit trees, and when they should be pruned, and his afternoons in his garden, where he put his knowledge into practice. In the evening he played cards with his father-in-law, and supped in public with the queen, and by 10 o'clock everybody in the palace was fast asleep. The queen, on her side, was quite as happy as her husband. She loved to be in her dairy, and nobody in the kingdom could make such delicious cheeses. But however busy she might be, she never forgot to bake a little barley cake and make a tiny cream cheese, and to put them under a particular rose tree in the garden. If you had asked her whom they were for and where they went to, she could not have told you, but would have said that on the night of her marriage a fairy had appeared to her in a dream and had bidden her to perform this ceremony. After the king and the queen had 6 children, a little boy was born, with a small red cap on his head, so that he was quite different from his brothers and sisters, and his parents loved Cadichon better than any of them. The years went on, and the children were growing big, when, one day, after Gillette the queen had finished baking her cake and had turned it out on a plate, a lovely blue mouse crept up the leg of the table and ran to the plate. Instead of chasing it away, as most women would have done, the queen pretended not to notice what the mouse was doing, and was much surprised to see the little creature pick up the cake and carry it off to the chimney. She sprang forwards to stop it, when suddenly both the mouse and cake vanished, and in their place stood an old woman only a foot high, whose clothes hung in rags about her. Taking up a sharp-pointed iron stick, she drew on the earthen floor some strange signs, uttering 7 cries as she did so, and murmuring something in a low voice, among which the queen was sure she caught the words faith, wisdom, happiness. Then, seizing the kitchen broom, she whirled it 3 times round her head and vanished. Immediately there arose a great noise in the next room, and on opening the door, the queen beheld 3 large cockchafers, each one with a princess between its feet, while the princes were seated on the backs of 3 swallows. In the middle was a car formed of a single pink shell and drawn by 2 robin redbreasts, and in this car Cadichon was sitting by the side of the blue mouse, who was dressed in a splendid mantle of black velvet fastened under her chin. Before the queen had recovered from her surprise, cockchafers, redbreasts, mouse, and children had all flown, singing, to the window and disappeared from view. The loud shrieks of the queen brought her husband and father running into the room, and when at last they made out from her broken sentences what had really happened, they hastily snatched up some stout sticks that were lying about and set off to the rescue, one going in one direction and the other in another. For at least an hour the queen sat sobbing where they had left her, when at last she was roused by a piece of folded paper falling at her feet. She stooped and picked it up eagerly, hoping that it might contain some news of her lost children. It was very short, but when she had read the few words, Gillette was comforted, for it bade her take heart, as they were well and happy under the protection of a fairy. On your own faith and prudence depend your happiness, ended the writer. It is I who have all these years eaten the food you placed under the rose tree, and some day I shall reward you for it. Everything comes to him who knows how to wait, is the advice given by the Fairy of the Fields. Then the queen rose up and bathed her face and combed her shining hair. and as she turned away from her mirror, she beheld a linnet sitting on her bed. No one would have known that it was anything but a common linnet, and yesterday the queen would have thought so too. But this morning so many wonderful things had happened that she did not doubt for a moment that the writer of the letter was before her. "Pretty linnet," said she, "I will try to do all you wish. Only give me, I pray you now and then, news of my little Cadichon." And the linnet flapped her wings and sang and flew away. So the queen knew that she had guessed rightly, and thanked her in her heart. By and by the king and his seneschal returned, hungry and tired with their fruitless search. They were amazed and rather angry to find the queen, whom they had left weeping, quite cheerful. Could she really care for her children so little and have forgotten them so soon? What could have caused this sudden change? But to all their questions Gillette would only answer, "Everything comes to him who knows how to wait." "That is true," replied her father, "and after all, your Majesty must remember that the revenues of your kingdom would hardly bear the cost of 7 princes and princesses brought up according to their rank. Be grateful, then, to those who have relieved you of the burden." "You are right. You are always right," cried the king, whose face once more beamed with smiles, and life at the palace went on as before, till Cataldo received a piece of news which disturbed him greatly. The queen, his mother, who had for some time been a widow, suddenly made up her mind to marry again, and her choice had fallen on the young king of the Green Isles, who was younger than her own son, and besides, handsome and fond of pleasure, which Cataldo was not. Now the grandmother, foolish though she was in many respects, had the sense to see that a woman as old and as plain as she was could hardly expect a young man to fall in love with her, and that, if this was to happen, it would be needful to find some spell which would bring back her youth and beauty. Of course, the fairy Gangana could have wrought the change with one wave of her wand, but unluckily the two were no longer friends, because the fairy had tried hard to persuade the queen to declare her niece heiress to the crown, which the queen refused to do. Naturally, therefore, it was no use asking the help of Gangana to enable the queen to take a second husband who would be certain to succeed her, and messengers were sent all over the neighboring kingdoms, seeking to find a witch or a fairy who would work the wished-for miracle. None, however, could be found with sufficient skill, and at length the queen saw that if ever the king of the Green Isles was to be her husband, she must throw herself on the mercy of the fairy Gangana. The fairy's wrath was great when she heard the queen's story, but she knew very well that, as the king of the Green Isles had spent all his money, he would probably be ready to marry even an old woman, like her friend, in order to get more. So, in order to gain time, she hid her feelings, and told the queen that in 3 days the spell would be accomplished. Her words made the queen so happy that 20 years seemed to fall from her at once, and she counted not only the hours but the minutes to the appointed time. It came at last, and the fairy stood before her in a long robe of pink and silver, held up by a tiny brown dwarf who carried a small box under his arm. The queen received her with all the marks of respect that she could think of, and at the request of Gangana, ordered the doors and windows of the great hall to be closed, and her attendants to retire, so that she and her guest might be quite alone. Then, opening the box, which was presented to her on one knee by the dwarf, the fairy took from it a small vellum book with silver clasps, a wand that lengthened out as you touched it, and a crystal bottle filled with very clear green water. She next bade the queen sit on a seat in the middle of the room, and the dwarf to stand opposite her, after which she stooped down and drew 3 circles round them with a golden rod, touched each of them thrice with her wand, and sprinkled the liquid over both. Gradually, the queen's big features began to grow smaller and her face fresher, while at the same time the dwarf became about twice as tall as he had been before. This sight, added to the blue flames which sprang up from the 3 circles, so frightened the queen that she fainted in her chair, and when she recovered, both the page and the fairy had vanished. At first she felt vaguely puzzled, not remembering clearly what had happened. Then it all came back to her, and jumping up she ran to the nearest mirror. Oh, how happy she was! Her long nose and her projecting teeth had become things of beauty. Her hair was thick and curly and bright gold. The fairy had indeed fulfilled her promise. But in her hurry and pleasure, the queen never noticed that she had not been changed into a beautiful young lady, but into a very tall little girl of 8 or 9 years old. Instead of her magnificent velvet dress, edged with fur and embroidered in gold, she wore a straight muslin frock with a little lace apron, while her hair, which was always combed and twisted and fastened with diamond pins, hung in curls down her back. But if she had only known, something besides this had befallen her, for except as regards her love for the King of the Green Isles, her mind as well as her face had become that of a child, and this her courtiers were aware of, if she was not. Of course they could not imagine what had occurred, and did not know how to behave themselves, till the chief minister set them the example by ordering his wife and daughters to copy the queen's clothes and way of speaking. Then, in a short time, the whole court, including the men, talked and dressed like children, and played with dolls or little tin soldiers, while at the state dinners nothing was seen but iced fruits, or sweet cakes made in the shape of birds and horses. But whatever she might be doing, the queen hardly ceased talking about the King of the Green Isles, whom she always spoke of as my little husband. And as weeks passed on, and he did not come, she began to get very cross and impatient, so that her courtiers kept away from her as much as they could. By this time, too, they were growing tired of pretending to be children, and whispered their intention of leaving the palace and taking service under a neighboring sovereign, when, one day, a loud blast of trumpets announced the arrival of the long-expected guest. In an instant all was smiles again, and in spite of the strictest rules of court etiquette, The queen insisted on receiving the young king at the bottom of the stairs. Unfortunately, in her haste, she fell over her dress and rolled down several steps, screaming like a child from fright. She was not really much hurt, though she had scratched her nose and bruised her forehead, but she was obliged to be carried to her room and have her face bathed in cold water. Still, in spite of this, she gave strict orders that the king should be brought to her presence the moment he entered the palace. A shrill blast outside her door sent a twinge of pain through the queen's head, which by this time was aching badly. But in her joy at welcoming her future husband, she paid no heed to it. Between two lines of courtiers, bowing low, the young king advanced quickly, but at the sight of the queen and her bandages, broke out into such violent fits of laughter that he was forced to leave the room, and even the palace. When the queen had recovered from the vexation caused by the king's rude behavior, she bade her attendants to hasten after him and fetch him back, but no promises or entreaties would persuade him to return. This, of course, made the queen's temper even worse than it was before, and a plot was set on foot to deprive her of the crown, which would certainly have succeeded had not the fairy Gangana, who had only wished to prevent her marriage, restored her to her proper shape. But far from thanking her friend for this service, the sight of her old face in the mirror filled her with despair, and from that day she hated Gangana with a deadly hatred. And where were Petaldo's children all this while? Why, in the island of Bambini, where they had playfellows to their heart's content, and plenty of fairies to take care of them all. But out of all the 7 princes and princesses whom the queen had seen carried off through the window, there was only Cadishon who was good and obedient. The other 6 were so rude and quarrelsome that they could get no one to play with them, and at last, as a punishment, the fairy changed them all into marionettes, till they should learn to behave better. Now, in an unlucky moment, the fairy of the fields determined to visit her friend, the queen of the fairies, who lived in a distant island, in order to consult her as to what was to become of Cadishon. As she was entering the hall of audience, Gangana was leaving it, and sharp words were exchanged between them. After her enemy had flown off in a rage, the fairy of the fields poured out the whole story of Gangana's wickedness to the queen, and implored her counsel. "Be comforted," answered the fairy queen. "For a while she must work her will, and at this moment she is carrying off Cadishon to the island where she still holds her niece captive. But should she make an evil use of the power she has, her punishment will be swift and great. And now I will give you this precious phial. Guard it carefully, for the liquid it contains will cause you to become invisible, and safe from the piercing eyes of all fairies. Against the eyes of mortals it has no charm." With a heart somewhat lighter, the fairy of the fields returned to her own island, and, the better to protect the 6 new marionettes from the wicked fairy, she sprinkled them with a few drops of the liquid, only avoiding just the tips of their noses, so that she might be able to know them again. Then she set off for the kingdom of Petaldo, which she found in a state of revolt, because for the first time since he had ascended the throne, he had dared to impose a tax. Indeed, matters might have ended in a war, or in cutting off the king's head, had not the fairy discovered a means of contenting everybody, and of whispering anew to the queen that all was well with her children, for she dared not tell her of the loss of Cadichon. And what had become of Cadichon? Well, the Fairy of the Fields had found out, by means of her books, which had told her, that the poor little boy had been placed by Gangana in an enchanted island, round which flowed a rapid river, sweeping rocks and trees in its current. Besides the river, the island was guarded by 24 enormous dragons, breathing flames, and forming a rampart of fire which it seemed as if none could pass. The Fairy of the Fields knew all this, but she had a brave heart, and determined that by some means or other she would overcome all obstacles, and rescue Cadichon from the power of Gangana. So, taking with her the water of invisibility, she sprinkled it over her, and mounting her favorite winged lizard, set out for the island. When it appeared in sight, she wrapped herself in her fireproof mantle. Then, bidding the lizard return home, she slipped past the dragons and entered the island. Scarcely had she done so than she beheld Gangana approaching her, talking loudly and angrily to a genius who flew by her side. From what she said, the fairy learned that Petaldo's mother, the old queen, had died of rage on hearing of the marriage of the king of the Green Isles to a young and lovely bride, and instead of leaving her kingdom to Gangana, had bequeathed it to one of the children of her son, Petaldo. But all the trouble I have had with that foolish old woman shall not go for nothing, cried Gangana. Go at once to my stables and fetch out the strongest and swiftest griffins you can find in the stalls, and harness them to the yellow coach. Drive this, with all the speed you may, to the Isle of Bambini, and carry off the 6 children of Petaldo that are still there. I will see to Petaldo and Gillette myself. When I have got them all safe here, I will change the parents into rabbits and the children into dogs. As for Cadichon, I have not quite made up my mind what I shall do with him. The Fairy of the Fields did not wait to hear more. No time was to be lost in seeking the help of the Fairy Queen if Petaldo and his family were to be saved from this dreadful doom. So, without waiting to summon her lizard, she flew across the island and past the dragons till her feet once more touched the ground again. But at that instant a black cloud rolled over her. Loud thunder rent the air, and the earth rocked beneath her. Then wild lightnings lit up the sky, and by their flashes she saw the 24 dragons fighting together, uttering shrieks and yells, till the whole earth must have heard the uproar. Trembling with terror, the fairy stood rooted to the spot. And when day broke, island, torrent, and dragons had vanished, and in their stead was a barren rock. On the summit of the rock stood a black ostrich, and on its back were seated Cadichon and the little niece of the fairy Gangana, for whose sake she had committed so many evil deeds. While the Fairy of the Fields was gazing in surprise at this strange sight, the ostrich spread its wings and flew off in the direction of the Fortunate Isle. and, followed unseen by the good fairy, entered the great hall where the queen was sitting on her throne. Proud and exultant was Gangana in her new shape, for by all the laws of fairydom, if she succeeded in laying Cadachon at the feet of the queen and received him back from her, he was in her power for life, and she might do with him as she would. This the good fairy knew well and pressed on with all her strength, for the dreadful events of the night had almost exhausted her. But with a mighty effort, she snatched the children away from the back of the ostrich and placed them on the lap of the queen. With a scream of baffled rage, the ostrich turned away, and Gangana stood in her place, waiting for the doom which she had brought upon herself. "You have neglected all my warnings," said the queen, speaking more sternly than any fairy had ever heard her. "And my sentence is that during 200 years you lose all your privileges as a fairy, and under the form of an ostrich shall become the slave of the lowest and wickedest of the genii whom you have made your friends. As for these children, I shall keep them with me, and they shall be brought up at my court." And so they were, until they grew up and were old enough to be married. Then the Fairy of the Fields took them back to the kingdom of the old queen, where Pataldo was now reigning. But the cares of state proved too heavy both for him and Gillette, after the quiet life they had led for so many years, and they were rejoiced to be able to lay aside their crowns and place them on the heads of Cadachon and his bride, who was as good as she was beautiful, though she was the niece of the wicked Gangana. And so well had Cadachon learned the lessons taught him at the court of the Fairy Queen, that never since the kingdom was a kingdom had the people been so well governed or so happy. And they went about the streets and the fields smiling with joy at the difference between the old times and the new, and whispering softly to each other, "Everything comes to him who knows how to wait." And now, as we come to the end of this session, if you're still awake, I would like you to feel the calm you've created within yourself. You've given your mind and body such a beautiful gift, a moment to simply be. Let that sense of peace stay with you as you move through the rest of your night. If you'd like, you can stay here a little longer.